Well, welcome into Ransom Church. Welcome to the final week in our series, Life Actually. If you don't know me, my name is Paul. I'm the Connections pastor here, and you need to know that I'm a nerd. I have a variety of nerd pursuits. I diversify my nerdness, but one of them is useless random trivia. I love it. It's just, I enjoy it. I love Trivial Pursuit, all those things. I'm not necessarily great at it. I'm not super smart or anything, but I just like knowing stupid random things. I've had my fair share of phases where I would tune in and watch the classic show Jeopardy. Any Jeopardy fans in here? Yes, me and all the old people. Okay, that's great. If you haven't watched Jeopardy, it's a trivia show. It's a quiz show. There's 2 rounds it's the big blue board with the categories, right? And so they're earning money throughout. But then it all comes down to Final Jeopardy. And the contestants, the host will give the contestants the category, and then they have to make a wager. But they don't know the full clue, like the specific clue. They just know the category, and they have to wager how much they're going to risk on this final Jeopardy round. Now, there's some, strategy to, how much they wager and all of that. But really, a lot of it comes down to confidence. If it's a category that they're really confident in, they'll probably wager a whole bunch, maybe their entire total. If it's a category they have no confidence in, they probably won't risk anything at all if they feel like they can afford it, because they're not confident that they would know the answer. So let me ask you a fun question. What is a random trivia category that you would just be so confident about that you would wager everything that you had earned in the game so far? You'd double or nothing, all on this one category. For example, one of the categories, like really niche category, but the category, if I saw this, I would be like, yes, sign me up for it. That category would be the 1998 Denver Broncos. That was a very formative time in my life. I feel like I'm confident I would know the answer to something in that. So what's a category for you that would be in that same vein that you're so confident about you'd risk it all? So take a second to think about that, and then I actually want you to tell somebody around you, next to you. If you're watching at home, maybe text somebody. They'll have no clue what's going on, but tell somebody around you, and then we'll kind of come back. So take just a second to do that. Definitely hearing some extra nerdiness out there. Now, I am excited to hear everybody's answer to this because I'm fascinated by it. But here's my point with the whole deal. When it comes to risk, confidence matters. I think that makes sense, right? When it comes to risk, confidence matters. When it comes to what we're willing to risk, what we're willing to put on the table, so to speak, our level of confidence makes a huge difference in the amount that we're willing to risk. So here's a question for us as we're sitting in church today. When it comes to following Jesus, when it comes to doing what he calls us to do, what he asks us to do, what are you willing to risk? You might even think that you are totally committed to God, but what are you actually willing to risk? This is what we've been talking about as a church quite a bit recently. Not just in theory, not just what sounds good, but in real life. What are you actually willing to risk for God? Your money, your relationship, your career, your schedule, your reputation. When it comes to changing your life for the sake of Jesus and what he calls us to do, what are you actually risking? When it comes to risk, confidence matters. And maybe you've never thought of it this way, but if you aren't really willing to risk much or maybe anything at all, it might mean that you don't really have confidence in God. And some of you would say outright, yeah, I don't have confidence in God. But some of you might think you have confidence in God, but you actually don't because you're not taking any risks. And either way, if confidence is a question mark for you, it's a conversation worth exploring on why that's the case and how that could change. So today we're going to spend some time in a really interesting chapter of the Bible, Hebrews chapter 11. If you brought a Bible, you can turn there. If you didn't, you can raise your hand. Our ushers would love to bring you one. In our kind of blue Bibles here, we're on page 732, Hebrews chapter 11. Now, if you grew up in church or if you've been around a while, Hebrews 11 might ring a bell for you because this one chapter is noteworthy enough that it's even been given some special nicknames by church people over the years. Some call it the faith chapter. Some call it the heroes of the faith, or as I heard it growing up, it's the Hall of Faith, like Hall of Fame, Hall of Faith. The reason it gets all these nicknames is because this one chapter focused on faith lists out a whole bunch of names and groups of stories from people from the Old Testament. If you scan down through it, there's something like 18 listed just back to back to back. Some of them just mentioned, some of them with a little more detail to their story. And even if you don't really know the Bible at all, you probably recognize at least some of the names that are here in Hebrews 11. Names like Noah, right? Noah in the ark. Abraham, Father Abraham. Joseph, Moses, and on it goes. These are heroes when it comes to faith in God. That's Hebrews 11, and that's why it's pretty famous, pretty noteworthy. But here's the problem in my mind. I think the stories of all these heroes in Hebrews 11, I think they're cool and all, but I think they often get treated as trivia, right? As interesting facts and stories of people that we're not totally sure if they're real or not, or maybe the person's real, but the actual story or the details, I don't know about that. So it's certainly not useful information for our day-to-day lives. At best, it's just like, generic Bible knowledge. It's nice. I want my kids to learn about it, but certainly it's not going to impact the way that I live. And even more importantly, it's definitely not helpful for those hard things in life, those real tough seasons. I mean, when I come up against something difficult and life seems, scary or uncertain, maybe even hopeless, I don't need trivia. I don't need useless facts about, people or stories from thousands of years ago. I need answers for my day-to-day life. I need hope for my current situation. If I'm facing difficulty, or if I'm thinking about actually taking a step of faith and risking real things, maybe for the first time, I don't need trivia to back that up. What I need is confidence in God. I need a confident faith that will actually get me through the hard thing, or actually give me the courage I need to take a real risk. Hebrews 11 is the faith chapter. And I first learned it in the NIV. And Hebrews 11:1 says this in the NIV. It says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." That's what we need. Confidence. Assurance, not trivia. But let's be really honest in this space today. This is a place where it's okay to not be okay. And let's be honest, it's hard. It is hard sometimes to have confidence and assurance. It's hard to have hope. It's hard to keep trusting and to keep believing. Honestly, it can just be really hard to actually have confidence in God. Now, as I was thinking and praying through this, I had this visual come to mind. I told you my brain's weird, so you're going to have to bear with me. But I want you to think about confidence in God, right here, as like a physical, actual, tangible thing that I can grab onto, I can hold, I can see, I can look at, right? This is confidence in God. And what I'm going to do here is, some of you have been really nervous about what the poll is for. Don't worry. I'm going to put this confidence in God up here on this pole behind me. And I want you to think of it as this actual physical, tangible thing that is here, that's in the room, that we can see, that we can reach out to, that we can touch. Okay, so this represents our confidence in God. Now, here's what I've found to be true in life. I wonder if you would agree with me based on what you have seen. I think hard things that we go through in life, difficult situations that we face, push our confidence in God further and further away from us. Now, I'm guessing that we've all lived long enough to experience this. But here's what I mean. I'm talking about things like a rejection or a failure. Now, this is not confidence in God like rising and getting bigger. This is confidence in God getting further away from me. Let's keep going. This is like a messy breakup or a failed business venture or a layoff, a divorce, a diagnosis, a phone call about a friend, maybe a family member passed away. Now, all of a sudden, confidence in God is really far away from me. Every hard thing we face threatens to push confidence in God out of our reach. Confidence in God all of a sudden is so far away from me, I can't reach it. I can't even jump up and get it. I can barely even see it from where I am because it's so far out of reach. Life throws these hard things at us, sometimes all of them at once, and it just makes it hard to keep faith, hard to keep trusting because confidence in God is all of a sudden so far away from me. And even if we can make it through some of those hard situations and kind of get on to the normal parts of life, those experiences always have these long-term consequences. Like we said at the beginning, confidence is connected to risk. And the further that we get from confidence in God, the less likely we are to risk, to put things on the table and surrender to him. I mean, if my confidence in God is so far away from me, I'm sure not going to surrender or risk my time or my money and offer those things to people who need it or even to the church because confidence is just not even close to me anymore. If confidence in God is so far away from where it used to be, I'm not going to confess to an addiction or to a sin or this thing I've been struggling with and risk all the fallout that would come from that. No way. I'm not gonna talk about faith or Jesus with my family or with my coworkers and risk it getting awkward. I mean, I'm not in a place to even think about that because confidence in him seems out of reach, maybe even almost out of sight altogether. And if that's the case for us, even if we are putting on a good show for the church people around us, we aren't actually following Jesus anymore because following Jesus means risking real things, surrendering real things, actual parts of our life to him. We see that over and over and over in the way he calls us to live. It means risk and surrender. Now, here's another issue at play. I think way too often we try to pretend that this is not a real thing or that this shouldn't actually happen. Unintentionally, other Christians, maybe even pastors worst of all, might try to convince you that confidence in God should never actually move at all. And if it has moved away from you, it's probably actually your fault because you didn't have the right attitude or you didn't have the right perspective. If you just had real faith, then those hard things wouldn't have actually moved that confidence further away from you at all. If that's the case for you, or if it's ever been the case for you, first of all, I'm so sorry. And forgive us if we have ever been guilty of making you feel that way, because I'm absolutely convinced that God does not think that way. He doesn't operate that way. I'm convinced that Hebrews 11 is a prime example of how God does not just leave us alone and helpless and having to figure it out on our own when this is the case for us. Because the good news is that this Hall of Faith chapter and really the Bible as a whole, it's not just useless trivia. It can actually serve as confidence and assurance for us today in our actual real lives. So let's finally look a little closer at our chapter together to see how this actually works. So let's start again in verse 1. This time I'm going to switch over to the NLT that we typically use. So let's read starting in verse 1. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. Now, obviously, we can't go through each one on this list and do any sort of justice to the full story that would be entailed. So let me just give you a couple of brief highlights from the bigger list. And it might be helpful to kind of stick with the screens because we're going to be jumping around quite a bit here, just blasting through them. So let's go. Verse 7, it was by faith that Noah built a large boat or an ark to save his family from the flood. Verse 11, it was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. Verse 17, it was by faith that Abraham was willing to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Verse 22, it was by faith that Joseph said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. And then spoiler alert, verse 29, it was by faith that Moses and the people of Israel left Egypt. and went right through the Red Sea as though they were on dry ground. And there's so many more amazing stories in this list. And I love the way the list ends in verse 32. It says, how much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. And you're like, yes, it would be too long. Don't do that. Now listen, if you don't know any of the names or don't know the stories that are kind of being mentioned there, don't feel bad. Don't feel excluded from this conversation at all. It's never too late to start learning that stuff. But what's more important than the details of each of these stories is the bigger principle that's at play here. I told you, this is not just Bible trivia. This is not just something that's useless for our daily lives. I'm convinced that Hebrews 11 is not a list. Don't worry, I'm coming back. Hebrews 11 is not a list of useless, pointless trivia. Hebrews 11 is a ladder. Hebrews 11 is not a list, it's a ladder. The stories that are represented here and many others that didn't make the list are not useless trivia, and they're not meant to make us feel guilty because we're not as amazing as these people, but they are meant to serve as a ladder for us so that we can actually move to a place where confidence in God is actually in reach. And I know this is a unique way to think about it, so let me explain what I mean by this. Let's go back to verse 3. We kind of skipped over this, so let's go back to verse 3. It says, by faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. See, the first item on this list of heroes of faith is not actually an individual or a person, it's an event. The creation of the universe is the first thing on this list. Now listen, I don't know how God did it, but I do know that there is now a universe that exists. God spoke and nothing became something. That's a big deal. Now, in my life, when I am having a terrible day, a crappy day, and believe me, it happens, and on those days when confidence in God seems it's out of reach and maybe even getting further away by the minute, this seems like such a small, maybe even cheesy thing to do, but if it's at all possible, I try to take a moment and step outside. Or at least look out a window if that's all I can do. Because if I'm lucky, I might see trees, maybe birds. I might see a sunset over the cathedral. It's beautiful. I might see people walking or, somebody walking their dog. I might feel sun on my face, probably wind, maybe even snow on my face. But even in those moments, if I intentionally stop and just think for a moment, God created all of this. There is a creator of the universe responsible for all of this. If I stop in the middle of my hard day and acknowledge that truth, it doesn't take away everything that I'm facing. It doesn't solve all of my problems automatically, but it does give me a little bit more faith in that moment than I had the moment before. It gives me one step of confidence. I mentioned briefly the story of Sarah. I think it was verse 11. Sarah had a baby when it was biologically impossible for that to happen. Now that's a very personal story to me in my life because my wife and I have walked the journey of infertility. And it was not the way we thought it would happen, and there has been a lot of pain and struggle along the way, but we now have 2 beautiful, amazing children in our home. And when I think about the story of Sarah and I think about how she walked her journey with faith, even if it was imperfect, and I'm reminded of my own story and how God has been faithful not only to me but to others for thousands of years, it gives me a step of confidence when I need it. Moses, one of the most famous people in the whole Bible, was crazy insecure. He was not confident at all. Honestly, he had no qualifications to be the leader of God's people, yet God used him for incredible things and always gave him exactly what he needed to overcome his shortcomings and to lead through in the moments that were most important. There are more days than not that I feel unequipped for the calling God has placed in front of me. And stories of Moses are those reminders that God is going to give me what I need for the moments I need it too. And it gives me a step of confidence. And honestly, I don't think Hebrews 11 is meant to be like the be-all, end-all list. I think it's a reminder that there are steps on this ladder all over the place. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who has a bunch of amazing stories of his own, he's the guy that I'm named after. There's this one story that he was in prison, unjustly in prison, had this miraculous opportunity to escape and run free, yet he chose to stay in captivity for the sake of the person who was holding him captive. Now, I don't know if I could ever be that selfless, but when I hear that story, it inspires me, and it gives me a measure of faith on a day when I might exactly need that. And it's not just the Bible either. When we look back over the course of Christian history, we can see amazing women and men of faith who have faced incredible things, maybe insurmountable odds, and yet God has used their faithfulness and the way they lived their lives to impact me when I read about it, when I hear about it. It's inspiring, it's encouraging. Even looking around this room today, I see faces and I'm thinking of stories, knowing what you have walked through and knowing how you have been faithful and how God has carried you through things that seemed impossible. And it gives me a measure of faith. See, God has given me a ladder in my life to reach up and grab confidence when it seems completely out of reach because life has pushed it so far away from me. In Psalm 77, the psalmist spends the first 10 verses describing what can only be called a hopeless and a situation full of despair. I don't know what he was facing, but it was heavy. And it was even to the point where confidence and hope were so far out of reach that he was even asking the question, does God even love me anymore? And then in verse 11, in that reality, he says this, but then I recall all you have done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They are constantly in my thoughts. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works. And he moves up this ladder to where confidence in God is back in reach. See, having great faith is not about pretending that hard things don't exist. It's not about pretending that confidence in God sometimes goes away from us. And taking risks and surrendering real things is not out of blind obedience. Real faith is about looking at all that God has done, seeing his faithfulness from the very creation of the universe to this very moment that we're in right now. And when we take it all into account, we can climb the ladder to where hope and trust and confidence and assurance are not only possible, they're logical based on the picture of God and who he is. When we spill into Hebrews chapter 12, after this ladder that's listed in 11, it says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, witnesses in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and in history, in our world today, in this room, maybe even in our own story, since we're surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. God has given you a race to run, a journey of being set free to be who he made you to be. He has given you this journey to walk with him. And it's a journey of living more and more free of sin, of serving more free of self. And listen, there are going to be plenty of days where we forget about this stuff, where we accidentally sort of climb down the ladder because we're forgetting God's faithfulness. And there will be new hard things that we face that push confidence in God even further away from us. And honestly, we're going to have to get a bigger ladder. We're going to need more rungs on it. But that's exactly why, as a church, we encourage you, even challenge you often to do something, to actually take these steps of faith, to read your Bible and to ask questions about it, to join a class or a group, to sacrificially serve, to start giving. Because the beautiful thing is that the more we actually take these risks for Jesus and actively live out our faith, the more steps we actually end up adding to our ladder, because we're giving God chances to be faithful to us and opportunities for us to see his faithfulness. So today, I'm not actually going to challenge you to a specific action, but I am going to say, and I cannot encourage you enough, do not leave here without giving God space to maybe show you the ladder that he's already placed in your life, or to maybe even reveal to you places where he's asking you to trust him so that he can add to your ladder. To give him opportunities to follow through in faithfulness so that you can build your confidence, not out of blind obedience or just reckless hope, but out of this understanding that he has provided for thousands and thousands, for all of human history. God has been faithful, and he's been faithful in your life, and he wants to continue. We have been given a ladder toward confidence in God.